Okay, here we are. My little TV is not on. Let me see if I can turn it on. No, I don't know how. All right. Here we are, getting ready for the next, or fourth to the last week of this class, the Crusades. And last week, oh, you're going to turn it on for me? Okay, thank you. Last week we had a discussion and we talked about the two heroes of the Middle East and of the Western European Crusaders. We talked about Saladin and Richard Lionheart, and you all did a really, really good job of having a discussion, and so those who were here got extra credit for participating in that discussion. Okay, now tonight something really weird happens after the Third Crusade. You know, Jonathan Riley Smith sort of talks about the Third Crusade as solidifying the Crusades, and at that point now you have crusading being a tradition, and he looks at it as the beginning of what he calls the crusading movement, that now crusading is really embedded as an institution in Europe after the Third Crusade. And in a way, he talks of it as the Third Crusade as the beginning of the crusading movement, as if everything that happened before the Third Crusade was sort of not a crusade, which is an interesting concept, don't you think? What are you going to make of that, if it's really sort of not a crusade? And now, in his view, we're really getting into what are the real crusades after the Third Crusade. Okay, I take a somewhat different view. I see the First Crusade as breaking the ground and setting the pattern, and then it's solidified in some intermediate small crusades, and really solidified and copied in the Second Crusade, and then clearly becoming a tradition in the Third Crusade. So I see the first three crusades as real crusades. And apparently, Jonathan Riley Smith sort of doesn't. Now, everything after the Third Crusades, he said, is now the heart and the height of the crusading movement. Now we're into the real crusades, according to him. I see something kind of different going on. I see a proliferation of crusading, a diversification of crusading. Before the Third Crusade, just about everything is concentrated on the Holy Land. Now when we get into the Fourth Crusade, everything gets diverted and attention goes everywhere else. And part of it is Innocent III's fault. I mean, he sees the potential for the crusade and using it for political purposes within Europe and to strengthen the papacy, and he sees the potential in using it not just in the Holy Land but in a lot of other places. And we've seen some little, maybe, tendencies to think of crusading in the north, to think of crusading in Spain, but nobody really concentrated on it. Now Innocent III does. He really concentrates on the crusade, on what the potential of the crusades can be and how many places can he wage different crusades. And so no matter what, Innocent III represents a huge turning point, no matter how you view the crusades. In a way, it's as if Innocent III almost sounds the death knell of the Crusades in a way. I mean, I'm taking an opposite view to Jonathan Riley Smith here by saying it's kind of like the death knell, because it's all downhill after this, and everybody gets disillusioned about the Crusades, and you know that it becomes routine, and it starts getting sort of corrupt in a way. Because they use it for other purposes, and the Crusaders kind of, they're not so devoted, they're not so dedicated, they're not so idealistic anymore, but they're more out for what they can get, especially in the Albigensian Crusade, which we'll do next week, but also in the Northern Crusades, which we're going to do tonight. So think about these issues I'm raising, and we'll raise these questions again, and we'll talk about them again. But for tonight, we're going to do two things. In the first lecture, we're going to look at the Fourth Crusade, and you have a reading on the Fourth Crusade. I have a different edition of Robert of Clary than you do. This is an older edition, but I have mine marked up, so I didn't read the new one, which you have. And so the Conquest of Constantinople by Robert of Clary, who was a simple knight, and so we've got a simple knight's eyewitness account here, which is a really neat one. How did you like reading this book? Did you enjoy it? Was it a sort of fun adventure read? Okay, good. I'm glad you liked it. Well, we'll leave time to discuss a bit of it at the end. Okay, there's another eyewitness account, and this is by Geoffrey Villehardouin, and it's contained in this Penguin Classic, which has been out for 100 years practically, available to everyone. But it has two chronicles of the Crusades. Geoffrey Villehardouin on the Fourth Crusade, and Joinville on St. Louis' Crusade, and so it's another account. And Robert of Clary and Geoffrey Villehardouin kind of contradict each other. I mean, they give us a different viewpoint because Villehardouin is an aristocrat and of a higher social class than the simple knight Robert of Clary. So we get a slightly different slant on it. I'd like to recommend to you just a wonderful, wonderful book, which is a secondary source. Of course, these are primary sources I've been showing you, but I'd like to recommend this book by Don Queller, now joined by his student Thomas Madden, in the second edition, The Fourth Crusade, The Conquest of Constantinople. And it's a marvelous book. Of course, it's a modern account, weighing all of the primary sources and giving a lot of other evidence, but much, much longer than the one you read. So, which is one reason I didn't have you read it. But it really is a good book. If anybody's going farther into the Fourth Crusade, I recommend this book very highly. Okay. Now, so let's get to the Fourth Crusade. All right. Jonathan Riley Smith makes Innocent III the height of the crusading movement. Is he right? That's something we might talk about, the very last night of class, or even in an exam question. Is Innocent III right? Is Jonathan Riley Smith right? Is Innocent III the height of the crusading movement, or is he the downfall of the crusading movement? How did Innocent change the idea of crusading? Well, we're going to sort of run through that in looking at the next 3 or 4 crusades. Innocent himself had been educated in theology and canon law. He was very well educated. He was a very bright and learned man. He came up with some new theories on the papacy, and he's also regarded as the height of the imperial papacy, as the point when the papacy reached its highest moment of power. And there's all kinds of debate about whether he wanted to be Lord of the world or whether he was sincerely had a Christian idea of the sanctity of the papacy and its governance. He believed that the papacy should be set above the secular powers. He believed he should be Lord of the world and that all the kings should do homage to him. He saw the Pope as a kind of priest-king, and he actually achieved that in very many important ways. He actually got King John of England to give him England, to do homage for England to him and give him England as a fief, and so he was the feudal lord of England for the only time in history. Of course, what happened was eventually the barons of England rebelled and they would not recognize the Pope as their lord. Also, there was a power vacuum created in Germany by the death of the Emperor Henry VI, and with this opportunity, the opportunity in England and especially the opportunity in Germany, Innocent set out to turn theory into fact. There was no room for crusades directed by kings in his view. The crusade should be under the Pope's control. And he was also deeply concerned to rebuild the old Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, which was destroyed, as we recall, in 1187. How was it destroyed in 1187? What happened in 1187? Yeah, Matthew.
That's when the Muslim forces came back and basically reconquered everything, partially because of the power struggle within the within the Latin dynasty.
Yeah, so it's the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, essentially, in 1187. And of course, Richard Lionheart slightly restored it in 1192. He got that foothold back on the coast, but mostly, the Crusader states were mostly gone. He just had a few enclaves in the coast that remained. The reality of the situation was, as far as the Crusades were concerned, the active cooperation of rulers was needed. And this fact had been veiled by the success of the First Crusade, in which kings took no part. And so if you look back at the tradition, and remember, Europe was very tradition-bound, and they always looked at the past for their patterns. If you look at the First Crusade, kings had no part in it, and so Innocent had this idea that he could wage crusades without the help of kings. But a lot of things had happened in Europe up to that time. And in fact, there had been advances in kingship. The national states, or we might call them proto-national states, the kingdoms were solidifying, they were centralizing. They had instituted bureaucratic government in administrative government and organized government into their organization of the state in the intervening centuries. And so there had been a lot of state building going on, and the states were coalescing into real bureaucratic governments. And so the kings were much more powerful than they had been a century earlier, and they had access to a lot more money because they had administrations put into place, they had tax collecting systems put into place, they had a lot more control over their vassals. So Innocent, in a way, wasn't looking at reality. He couldn't see the changes that had taken place. And here we see these kingdoms, and I wanted to point out to you the important kingdoms. England was the most powerful kingdom on the continent. Even by this time, they had actually lost control of Aquitaine, but they still had Normandy and Brittany up until 1204 when they lost Normandy to France, but they still had Normandy and Brittany, and they had Gascony. Aquitaine was independent at this time. This is all there was to France, but it was centralizing and administratively copying England at this time. The county of Burgundy was pretty much independent. Germany was actually not solidified into a real country. It was actually a mess because they had continual civil wars, and this was largely the fault of the papacy, because pope after pope would interfere in the elections in Germany. Germany retained its quality of elective kingship. They didn't have hereditary kingship like that developed in England and France. And especially France was very strong on hereditary kingship. But in Germany, they held on to old-fashioned elective kingship, just like we saw in the Kingdom of Jerusalem when everything fell apart. Well, the popes helped that along by taking sides. When there were two candidates, they would play one off against the other, and they would promise support, papal support, to whichever candidate would support whatever papal program they were promoting at that time. And so this fomented civil war in Germany and prevented Germany from building a centralized kingdom like France and England were building. And so this was happening in the time of Innocent, and of course Henry VI provided him with an opportunity. The death of Henry VI provided Innocent with an opportunity to continue this papal policy of divide and conquer, essentially, in the German Empire. Now we can look at one more kingdom, the Kingdom of Italy and Sicily, which was very strong and had hereditary monarchy as well. And so that's kind of the situation in Europe at the time. In 1198, with that situation going on, Innocent called a new crusade. And he concentrated in calling the crusade on France and the Italian maritime cities. He wrote to the higher ranks of the clergy and to the cities with fleets. The kings, he said, should make peace with each other, but he did not call on any of the kings to take part in the Fourth Crusade. And they were probably too absorbed in their own affairs anyway. England and France were still quarreling, and in Germany there was a civil war over the succession with Philip of Swabia and Otto the Fourth as the two contenders. In France, the crusade was preached by the Cardinal Legate Peter Capuano and Fulk of Neuilly. Okay, Fulk was a product of the Paris universities. He was a reformer, well-groomed and suave, and the themes that he preached in this crusade were that the rich were unworthy of true atonement. Their crusades had failed, he said. The true chosen ones were the poor. The humble and impoverished suffering Christ was a pattern for human behavior. So Christ ennobled the poor, and he saw the poor as the ones of carrying on Christ's policy. The naked and defenseless Christ crucified was his symbol for the strength of the poor. The poor and the pure in spirit were called to free the Holy Land. But these ideas, as you all know, are completely out of touch with reality. We've already seen one crusade that the poor went on, and it was a total disaster. Okay, during recruitment for the Fourth Crusade, it became clear that feudal machinery was needed to recruit the knights. The kings had to do the recruiting, and the lords had to call up their vassals. It couldn't be a bottom-up movement, as Fulk of Neuilly preached. It had to be a top-down movement in order to be a success, in order even to call up the knights that were necessary to come. Here is a seal of the four nations of the Faculty of Arts of Paris, and I actually have another seal. This is a seal of the University of Paris. So the university education is now becoming important in the culture of Europe, and the universities are rising to a lot of power. So here is the seal of the University of Paris, and this is the seal of the four nations or Faculty of Arts. And so this would be France and England and Germany, and I'm not sure what the fourth one is here. It might be Normandy, okay, or it might be Italy. The diversion of the Fourth Crusade, and all of you know that the Fourth Crusade was diverted, of course. They never got to the Holy Land. They stopped, and first they conquered Zara, which was a Hungarian city, and then they conquered Constantinople, so they never made it. And this is one reason I was saying at the beginning, you know, everything's going awry. It's like they forget about the Holy Land. Their concentration is off of the Holy Land, and they start looking at other things. And so the Fourth Crusade was diverted. It was a consequence of the consequent shortage of money because the kings were not in charge of raising the Crusades. It was Innocent's organizing, or his attempts to organize, that really, and Fulk of Neuilly's preaching, that really led to the disaster of the Fourth Crusade. The idea of poor crusaders led to the disaster of the Children's Crusade in 1212, which was another one that happened in Innocent's time. In 1199, remember Innocent called the crusade in 1198. In 1199 was to be the date of the muster of the army, and that passed with nothing done. Innocent then tried to raise money a different way. Instead of having the kings raise it, as in the past, he declared a crusading tax of 1/40 of the income on all clerical incomes. It was actually an income tax, maybe the first income tax in history, on all the churchmen, even whether they're in minor orders or high orders, but 1/40 of the income on all churchmen. He continued preaching the crusade. Well, immediately the Cistercians refused to pay the tax. They saw this as taking away their liberties, and they accused the Pope of persecuting their order by taking their income. And Innocent had to back down, because remember, the Cistercians were very, very powerful. They had a network of monasteries all over Europe. St. Bernard of Clairvaux had been their highest spokesman in the Second Crusade, and they were a very powerful order. So Innocent had to back down and confirm that they were exempt from such taxation. Well, in November 1199, the first contingents gathered in Champagne, and the leaders, Count Theobald of Champagne and Louis of Blois, took the cross, along with Geoffrey of Villehardouin. And as I mentioned before, there were two chroniclers of this crusade, Villehardouin and Robert of Clary, a poor knight. Count Baldwin of Flanders and Hainault also joined, and many nobles of France followed. 6 envoys were sent to Italy to negotiate the treaty for the transport of the great army they were expecting to raise. And here is the seal of Theobald, Count of Champagne. Some of these names might be spelled differently. Thibault is French for Theobald of Champagne. Somehow these seals tend to all look alike, don't they? But you can tell who they belong to by the inscription around the edges that identifies who they are. Okay. He's actually called Count Palatine of Champagne, which is an important, it made him more powerful than a normal count. Okay, negotiations became a milestone in the history of diplomacy because this is the first time a diplomatic mission went with the diplomats having complete freedom of action. They had sort of guidelines and instructions, but they had the power to actually negotiate and make their own deal. And so this is the first time in history that we really have these diplomats empowered to do that. They were provided with blank charters with seals attached in advance so that they were allowed to fill out those blank charters. And even the decision to negotiate with Venice was made by the envoys. So what they did then was go to Venice, where they completed a treaty with the Doge Enrico Dandolo of Venice. And under this treaty, Venice was to provide transport and food for a year for 4,500 knights, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 foot soldiers. And they were also to supply 50 warships. The price that Venice was going to charge for these supplies was fixed at 85,000 marks of silver, and it was to be paid in 4 installments. However, the negotiators and the Doge of Venice had a secret clause to the treaty which they didn't announce to the public. The expedition was to be directed against Egypt, although they were going to tell the army that they were going against the Holy Land. Actually, the crusade would head for Damietta again and attack Egypt. Now, why would they do that? Is there any rationale to this decision to attack Egypt? Anybody have any ideas on that? Matthew?
It's the political source of all the power from the current Muslim dynasty.
Okay, yeah, of course.
If you're going to strike where it hurts, strike at the homeland.
Strike at the capital, yeah. Egypt is the headquarters of the ruling dynasty. The Ayyubids are ruling from Egypt, and so, hit them in their capital city, take their homeland. But they didn't think the Crusaders could handle that bit of information. They were telling the Crusaders, who they thought of as, less sophisticated, that we're going to the Holy Land to rescue Jerusalem. Okay, but it was a good strategy to strike at the heart of Ayyubid power, as we noticed. Okay, I have some pictures to show you here, and I want to tell you a little bit about Venice, because I think if I tell you something about Venice, it'll help you to understand where the Venetians were coming from and why they did what they did as we go along with this. Here is Henry Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, and here he is, this is his money, and here he is. Doge is a word for dukes, which means Duke of Venice. Doge means Duke. And here Henry Dandolo, and here is Christ, who is handing him the power to rule Venice, and Christ is on the other side of his coin. And so he sees himself as Christian duchy, but a city-state, not like the counties and duchies of France and the Kingdom of England, but a city-state. Okay, and here we see Venice, of course, which is totally different. It is so much the opposite of what England and France are all about and what they are like. What do you see here? We see Venice as the center of a whole group of islands along here, the Adriatic Sea here, and it's built on islands, and they don't have streets. Well, they do sort of have pathways in Venice between the buildings, but the main thoroughfares are canals. And so Venice is built on islands in the sea. And you can see the situation of Venice with all the islands there. And here is a neat map, a bird's eye view of Venice that I found that shows what it looks like. Here is the Grand Canal going through the center of Venice, and of course the sea on all sides. And then these little canals which serve as side streets. And here are the most important buildings. Let's see if we can find St. Mark's. Here is St. Mark's, and the Doge's Palace is right next to it. Here is the great piazza of St. Mark's, and here is a tower that is there, which we're going to see some pictures of. And Venice is completely a maritime economy. It is a merchant city. It's not feudal. It is so unlike the rest of Europe. It has a totally different mentality. And so what are the Venetians to get out of this? Well, they hope to make a profit. I mean, they're middle class. They're not feudal aristocrats. And they're focused on profit and shipping and trade. And so that's what this city is all about. It started in about 700 from the salt trade, and that's how they built their whole city, their whole city-state on that. Okay, here I have these wonderful watercolors I found in 2 different books, copyright-free books, so that we can get an idea of what Venice is like. And it was medieval. You know, when you see all the architecture, you're going to think this is the Italian Renaissance. You're going to think all these buildings come from the Italian Renaissance. They don't. They come from the Middle Ages. And the reason they look like Italian Renaissance building is because the Italian Renaissance was going on at the same time the Middle Ages were going on. And Italian Renaissance culture is different, and the culture in all of Italy, northern Italy and Venice is different. It's just a different culture. And so this is what they did in the Middle Ages. And while England and France were doing Middle Ages stuff, they were doing Renaissance stuff at the same time. Okay, so here's the Grand Canal with all these what look like Renaissance buildings along them, and they are. The gondoliers, of course, are the taxi cabs and the transportation, and of course you have bridges over all of the canals, and bridges between buildings and across the canals for the pedestrians. This is very medieval architecture, by the way, and even though it's side by side with what looks like Renaissance. And here is one of those little side canals. This is the Rio of the Assassins, the River of the Assassins, which is interesting. And in fact, this architecture looks quite Moorish, doesn't it? We see quite a bit of Islamic influence in the architecture of Venice. But the mentality here is so different from the feudal mentality of Europe. Here is St. Mark's in Venice, which is the big, glorious church that is there. And this is the Doge's Palace right beside it. You can see the corner of it. And this is the great piazza of St. Mark's in front where all the pigeons are. And St. Mark's it has these sort of domes that are very reminiscent of Islamic architecture. So again, this is a crossroads of culture and trade. This is the interior of St. Mark's, and I'm sorry I don't have a color picture of it because it's filled with golden mosaics, and it's just a glorious interior with beautiful mosaics and in a gold background and filled with statuary, and it's just I mean, breathtaking inside. It attests to the great wealth of Venice. This is St. Mark's, and this is the picture over the altar, which is actually a picture of St. Mark's over the altar with Christ and his saints ruling from St. Mark's over the altar. So this shows you their feeling of strength here. And this is the campanile. That's what I was trying to think of. The tower is called the campanile on the corner of that great piazza. And this is the Doge's Palace, the corner of the old library and the Doge's Palace, which is still there in Venice today. You can go see it. And here is the Piazzetta. Again, another view of Venice. And Santa Maria della Salute, one of the churches, the outlying churches, and it's filled with churches, beautiful churches like this, and from the same period. And here's the island of San Giorgio in Venice. So Venice had a really different mentality from the rest of Europe, and they had really different ambitions, really different hopes from the Crusade. And so that we can, maybe that'll help us understand their attitudes as we see what they actually did. Well, the envoys from Europe returned home, but Count Theobald of Champagne died immediately. And in June 1201 at Soissons, the barons chose the Marquis Boniface of Montferrat as the new leader. And Boniface of Montferrat, the family was actually Italian from northern Italy, and the family had strong ties to the Holy Land and Byzantium. He had relatives that were in the Kingdom of Jerusalem and were involved in the power struggles there. And so he was a good person to lead the Crusades because he had the right diplomatic ties. In April 1202, on the date of the departure, they failed to depart. It passed by unheeded, and the Crusades started breaking up before it even got going. The Burgundians and the Provençals decided to sail from Marseille and thus weakened the main army, and only the men of northern France and a small number of Germans made their way to Venice. Okay, they were led by a Cistercian abbot from Alsace, Martin of Paris, and when they got to Venice, they only had about 10,000 men. Okay, how many men did they plan for? Do you all remember?
4,500 knights, 9,000 squires, 20,000 foot soldiers.
Okay, so now they had about 1/4 of what they had planned for and what they had negotiated for the Venetians, and the Venetians had negotiated to pay for. But they only had 1/4 of the men, and therefore only 1/4 of the resources to draw on to pay what they'd already signed the contract to pay the Venetians for. Yeah, Stephen.
What were the numbers of the other people who had already sailed from Marseille?
I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know the numbers.
Would it have made up the difference, or would it not have mattered?
Probably my guess is it would be about half the army. I don't think they had as many as they planned. Anyway, I'll try to look that up for you during the break and see if I can find that number. It might be in Don Queller's book, but it might take me a minute to find the exact number. Well, so they arrived in Venice with only about 10,000 men, and sorry, I forgot 1 0 there. Oh, that makes a difference. Okay. The Venetians then refused to lower the price from that of the army of 33,500, and the Crusaders then remained 34,000 marks in debt. Okay, they had paid about 50,000 marks out of the 85,000 that they pledged, but even that huge sum was not enough to fulfill their contract. And so the Venetians held their feet to the fire. You know, you signed this contract, you owe us the money. They're businessmen, they're middle-class merchants, and they're businessmen. That's why they wouldn't change their mind, you know. And so here, then, here's a map that will show you where these places are. Here is Venice, and we're going to talk, here, of course, is Marseille, where a whole bunch of them came from to sail to the Holy Land this way. So they would have gone this way around southern Italy and from Marseille, and these were the people from southern France who made up the army, while the northern French did go overland to Venice, and Venice, of course, is right here. And at this point, the Venetians said, well, since you're all here and you owe us some money, we'll tell you how you can earn it. Okay, we have a plan. And here is the old port at Marseille, where the rest of the Crusaders set sail from. at Marseille, which was a grand port in southern France, which had grown very big merchant economy was growing in France at that time as well, but all of Europe was prospering, the ports more so than any others. And here is Marseille, as we see the map of southern France, where all these southern French and Burgundians, Burgundy is over here, and they all set sail from Marseille, which was more convenient to them than Venice was, anyway, being in the south of France. Okay, the Doge of Venice suggested a moratorium on their payments if they recaptured Zara. Okay, Zara was a city on the Dalmatian coast which the King of Hungary had taken in 1186. But the King of Hungary was a Christian king, and he had been a Christian king since about 950. And the leaders of the crusade had little choice but to comply to avoid immediate payment. They just didn't have the money. And so the Venetians said, well, you can take it out, by recapturing Zara for us. We want Zara back from the Hungarians. Some people in the army protested at attacking a Christian city, but the opposition was overruled. And those who protested and said we should not attack a Christian city were led by the Cistercians and Simon de Montfort. Remember Simon de Montfort's name, because we're going to run into him again later on. He's an important guy. He's getting experience on this crusade that he'll use later. In October 1202, the fleet sailed from Venice, and on 24 November, Zara was captured. The opponents, the Cistercians and Simon de Montfort, obtained the Pope's support and the Pope's voice against doing this, but his intervention was ineffective, or it may have reached them too late. The Pope Innocent delayed saying don't go until they had already set forth. And so here now we see them setting sail from Venice and going to Zara and capturing it along the coast here. On the Dalmatian coast, and of course they're going to go on to Venice along here. And here is Simon de Montfort in a very familiar pose. We often see these mounted warriors. Okay, we'll run into him again. Well, Innocent's response was he excommunicated the entire army. And the French and the Germans were able to persuade Innocent to lift the excommunications on them, but the Venetians remained excommunicated. And of course it was their idea. I mean, the French and the Germans said, well, the Venetians made us do it. And so Innocent sort of went along with that and kept the Venetians excommunicated. But Innocent still hoped to salvage the crusade, and he sacrificed his principles in order to keep on going with the crusade. I mean, what should he have done? He should have excommunicated all of them and made them stay excommunicated, because they conquered a Christian city with the Pope's army, in fact. And he was the King of Hungary was loyal. The King of Hungary was ready to go on the crusade, and so he should not have been conquered. Also, Innocent omitted to prohibit all human and political contact with the Venetians. When someone is excommunicated, that means automatically that no Christian in good standing is allowed to talk to them, to have anything to do with them, to negotiate with them. And so Innocent failed to issue this proclamation that no one was to have contact with them. Yeah.
I thought that prohibition was lifted for Crusaders.
It is, and that may have been why he lifted it for the French and the Germans. But what about the others? What about everybody else who was not a Crusader? I mean, he simply didn't spell it out to people, and so the Venetians could have contact with, for example, the Genoans or other Italians, and so he didn't put that into effect for them. I mean, he kind of was slipshod about it. And also the attack on a Christian city was a dangerous precedent. I mean, what are you going to do when you have crusading armies attacking Christians? And not, I mean, they weren't Greek Christians. They were Roman Catholics. They weren't even, schismatic Christians. They were Roman Catholics in good standing. And so this is a dangerous precedent. Meanwhile, the Pope's attitude to the crusade remained ambiguous. he tried to make the best of it, his wayward crusaders who had conquered Zara, but he only laid himself open to blame. The Crusaders had to spend the winter in Zara because, remember, it was November by the time they went there, and winters were cold in that time of the world, in that area of the world. But the crisis came at the turn of the year 1202 to 1203. Now remember that we said that Germany had two rival factions. One was Philip of Swabia, who declared himself emperor, Roman emperor and king of Germany, and the other was Otto IV. Okay, two rivals, both claiming Germany in the middle of a civil war. The German king Philip of Swabia sent envoys to the Crusaders in Zara, and they arrived just at the new year. And also, along with those German envoys came envoys from the pretender to the throne of Byzantium, Alexius IV Angelus. Also, okay, the two sets of envoys arrived, one on the heels of another. Alexius IV was a son of Isaac II Angelus, and Isaac II had been king, the emperor of Byzantium, but he had been blinded and driven off the throne by his brother Alexius III. Okay, somehow there's a rule that Byzantine emperors cannot rule if they're blind. And in one case, a rival faction cut off the emperor's nose. Apparently, if you can't rule if you don't have a nose either. And so what he did was get a silver nose to replace it when he retook the throne. But this is sort of a tradition in the Byzantine Empire. But Isaac was blinded and driven off the throne by his brother Alexius III. Now, Isaac's sister, Irene, was the wife of Philip of Swabia. Okay. In 1201, Alexius IV escaped from prison. I'm sorry, by his sister. I think this is Alexius IV's sister, Irene, not Isaac's sister, but Alexius IV's sister, was the wife of Philip of Swabia. In 1201, Alexius IV escaped from prison, and he fled to Germany to get the help of his wife, who was married to the King of Germany. Innocent III, however, refused to aid his cause. First, Alexius IV appealed to Innocent, and Innocent refused to help him, so Alexius turned to Philip. But Innocent had decided for Philip's rival, Otto IV, in the civil war that they were having. And so this was a power play on Philip's part to reconfirm his own status in the kingdom by getting the alliance of and legitimacy by helping to restore Alexius IV to the Byzantine throne. Okay, here is Philip of Swabia in a portrait on his coinage. Okay, and he's showing himself as king of Germany with the scepter and the crown and the orb and scepter of rule. And here is the money of Alexius III Comnenus Angelus, and he was the emperor of Byzantium who had deposed Isaac and blinded him. Okay, that's that emperor. Here is the money of Isaac Angelus, and this was just, I just showed this one, which is the portrait of Isaac Angelus, who had ruled before Alexius III deposed him. Okay, and now they're trying to restore Isaac and his son, Alexius IV. Philip of Swabia then seized the chance to take over the crusade by restoring Isaac Angelus. Alexius, however, had promised the moon. He promised to the Crusaders that he would reunite the Orthodox Church with the Roman Church, and he would put the Orthodox Church under the control of the Roman Catholics, and so this was appealing to the Crusaders. He also promised huge sums of money for the Venetians and the Crusaders, and he promised 10,000 Byzantine soldiers. Okay, these were very large promises, and would he be able to fulfill them? Well, let's see if that happened. The Doge of Venice now thought that was a great idea. He liked the idea of conquering, not conquering Constantinople, but restoring Alexius IV. and getting all of these rewards that were promised. And the most powerful leaders of the French also signed the treaty. But only 12 of the barons in all actually signed the treaty. So the majority of the barons were not in favor of restoring Alexius to the throne. Boniface of Montferrat was also in favor, and he was a major leader, but the fierce opposition, again, was led by Simon de Montfort and the abbot of Le Vaux de Cernay. But finally, even the bishops who were along were persuaded to agree to the project. So the crusade set out to restore Alexius IV and his father Isaac, who was in prison at the time. There was a legal argument in favor of a legitimate dynasty. I mean, because Isaac had been deposed and Isaac was the rightful ruler, and this appealed to the feudal barons because they thought of, themselves naturally. If they were deposed, they would want their legitimacy to be restored, and this made a considerable impression on the knights. The knights were also attracted to the unbelievable quantity of relics in Constantinople, and the barons and the knights had a notorious greed for booty, and so they thought of everything in the golden city of Constantinople. Also, there was a lot of hatred of the Greeks, and there was a lot of Greek hatred for the Latins. I mean, in the 100 years that the Crusades had gone on, the enmity between the Greeks and the Latins had really sharpened, and so there was a lot of animosity between the two factions. The schismatic Byzantines were not worthy of the richest treasure of relics, according to the Latin view. And the Pope sort of dilly-dallied. I mean, he didn't act, and he didn't protest until June 1203, and by then it was too late. And you kind of wonder if he wasn't making a political move by putting off doing anything. I mean, maybe he was letting events take their course and without nipping them in the bud. I mean, he might have been dilly-dallying on purpose here. So he didn't protest until June, but the fleet had left Zara in April. And on Corfu, half the army rebelled, but Boniface of Montferrat and the Venetians prevented their dispersal and rallied them together and to get together. And by June 24th, 1203, the fleet dropped anchor at Chalcedon opposite Constantinople. And so that was when Innocent protested. I mean, he waited until they were there in Constantinople to protest. I think it was just, play acting. He was just making a gesture by protesting because it was the right thing to do. Okay, so here we see their route as they go along here. They go to Zara, and then they go along to Corfu, and then they go around Greece and up to Constantinople here, and that's their route. And here is the fleet. This is from a manuscript, 14th century manuscript showing the fleet coming up before Constantinople. And here is the kind of ship that they would have used in the 13th century. This is what the ships would have looked like. There are two sides in the controversy over the Fourth Crusade, two theories as to what happened. The first theory is chance, that in fact the Fourth Crusade happened the way it did as a result of a series of accidents. One accident, the Crusaders didn't quite make, all of them didn't make it to Venice. It's an accident, and then because of that accident, then the Doge on the spur of the moment said, go to Zara, and then once they got to Zara, they got the idea Alexius was there, another accident, and then they end up in Constantinople. The other theory is, and that's largely based on Villehardouin's account, where he just says, one accident after another. The intrigue theory says that the attack on Constantinople is the result of a skillful plot that was long prepared. The intrigue theory is based on the Cypriot chronicler Ernul, who blamed the Venetians for the plot. And the Byzantines looked at the Venetians as enemies, and they had for a long time. They had had a lot to do with the Venetians over several hundred years because the Venetians had had a long presence in Constantinople. Enrico Dandolo was a statesman who practiced realpolitik, and realpolitik is to use power plays and to use diplomacy, and war is the natural extension of diplomacy. That's essentially the theory of realpolitik. Enrico Dandolo was determined to ensure the perpetual dominance of Venice in the Mediterranean, and there had also been a background of violent anti-Latin pogroms in the Byzantine East. But today, that was what Ernul said. Ernul said that it was Enrico Dandolo's plot. But today, the intrigue theory tends to hold Philip of Swabia responsible. And that really depends on the date of Alexius IV's arrival in Europe. Did he arrive in 1201 or 1202? And if he arrived in 1201, then we can see a plot taking place. If he arrived in 1202, it's a more accidental kind of happening. But we don't know what date he arrived, and your guess is as good as mine which one he actually arrived. So we really don't know. This is all theoretical and interpretive guesses, our best guess as to what actually happened. Well, some other things we do know happened. In June, the Crusaders launched an attack on Constantinople and seized the suburb of Galata. And there they broke the chain blocking the harbor of the Golden Horn. And that, of course, had been the main protection of Constantinople. All those hundreds of years, it had been invulnerable to attack by sea. The Vikings had tried to attack it by sea, and they repulsed them. And everybody, the Muslims had attacked over and over and over by sea, and the Byzantines successfully repulsed them. But on 17 July, the Crusaders attacked Constantinople from both sea and land. The city was actually saved by the courage of the English and Danish Varangian Guard, mercenaries who were protecting the city. But Alexius III, the emperor, the acting emperor, lost his head and fled. And so Isaac II Angelus was led out of jail, and he and his son Alexius IV, who had come along with the Crusaders, came to the throne as co-emperors. But when Alexius IV started to rule, their government was entirely in the hands of the Crusaders. Soon it became clear that Alexius could not fulfill his financial promises. He was hated by the anti-Latin population of Constantinople, and he couldn't fulfill either the money that he could get from the people of Constantinople or the army that he promised, or the rich relics. Well, here is the siege of a maritime villa by ships, and here you see this is an interesting one, a ship with a siege engine mounted on it going in to fire over the walls of the city and the attackers. And here is Venice again, so that we can see St. Mark's. In January 1204, a revolt of the people of Byzantium swept Alexius and his father Isaac off the throne, and both of them were murdered. Now a new emperor came to the throne, Alexius V, Ducas Bucephalus, and anti-Latin. And so Alexius V hated the Latins with fury, and so did the city of the people of Constantinople. So the Crusaders then decided to make an end of the empire and wrote a new constitution. On the 12th of April, the Crusaders stormed the walls, and on the 13th of April, it was all over. For 3 days, the city was given over to killing and looting by a barbaric mob of soldiers. The most splendid plunder was the quadriga, which still adorns St. Mark's in Venice. Okay, that's why I had the picture of St. Mark's. The quadriga is not here. Does anybody know what the quadriga is? Okay, it's a statue of 4 horses together that were stolen from ancient Rome, and well, they were stolen from Constantinople, but they were from ancient Rome. They had been in Constantinople, and now the Venetians took them to St. Mark's, where they were out in front of St. Mark's Cathedral. Okay, so that's the quadriga. Villehardouin boasted that never before had so rich a haul been taken from a single city. Nicetas, saved by a Venetian merchant, penned a moving lament. In March 1204, the Byzantine Empire was dismembered, and the calculating hand of Venetian policy was evident. The Venetians took the lion's share of the spoils. They got 3/4 of the plunder, and they set up an interesting government. And look at the kind of government that they set up and see what you think of this. An electoral council of 6 Venetians and 6 Frenchmen met to choose a new emperor. Boniface of Montferrat was one of the candidates, but the Venetians blocked him because he was too strong, and what they wanted was a weaker guy, and so they picked Baldwin of Flanders. On 16 May, Baldwin was crowned in Hagia Sophia as the first emperor of the Romans. And Hagia Sophia is the Church of Holy Wisdom that is now, it's still standing, it's now a mosque in the middle of Constantinople. But it was a magnificent cathedral. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was now founded. The coronation was celebrated according to the Latin rites, but the Treaty of 1204 deprived the Emperor Baldwin of any real power. He was excluded from the distribution of the 600 fiefs, and the distribution was carried out by a commission of Venetians and Frenchmen. The emperor received 2 palaces in Constantinople, plus 1/4 of the empire, which included Thrace and northwest Asia Minor, Lesbos, Chios, and Samos. Boniface founded the emperor of Thessalonica, which included Macedonia and Thessaly, and most of the new ruling class was Lombards. The Venetians renounced Epirus and Morea, the Peloponnese, but took the Adriatic coast and ports on the west coast of the Peloponnese, the Ionian Islands, and bases on the archipelago. Marco Sanudo founded a duchy of the archipelago with Naxos and Andros and suzerainty over the Cyclades. And I'll show you a map in just a minute if all this is really confusing. Euboea became a Venetian protectorate and bought out Crete. The most important harbors on the Hellespont and the Sea of Marmora went to the Venetians, and also Thrace of Constantinople, including Hagia Sophia. The Venetians now had absolute control of the sea route between Venice and Byzantium, and a Venetian colonial empire had been created, which lasted until it was overrun by the Ottoman Turks in the 16th century. It was ruled by a Venetian podesta assisted by a council, and remained fully under the control of the Republic of San Marco, and that's what the Venetian Empire was called, the Republic of San Marco, ruled by a podesta, which was like a duke, with the assistance of a kind of baronial council. But in this case, since it's a city and it's not feudal, it's a council of merchants and rich merchants and rich people from the city of Venice. Almost a democratic form of government. Okay, here is the Byzantine Empire in 1203, before the Fourth Crusade got there. Okay, here is the Byzantine Empire as the Crusaders carved it up. Okay, now let's look at the different components of the empire. This is the Latin Empire, which Baldwin ruled. The orange, this red is the Principality of Achaia. The Venetians had all the yellow, which is all these islands surrounding Greece, these islands here, and Crete, all the way to Byzantium. All these islands are Venetian. The kingdom of Thessalonica is here. That's a Crusader kingdom. And here we have the despotate of Epirus, and I believe that is, I'm not sure if that's a Crusader kingdom, but this is all that's left of the Empire of Nicaea, which the Byzantine emperors are ruling. Okay, yeah, question, Matthew.
It's a little off topic, but I noticed Cyprus on the map. Whatever, it seems like after a while Cyprus dropped out of the radar on our Crusades history. What happened? Did it get overrun by Saladin and company, or was it still a Crusader state, or what
No,
happened?
good question. It's still a Crusader state, and it's the only Crusader state that survives. And it actually lasts, I think it lasts up until the 16th or 17th century. But Cyprus stays a Crusader state, and they have a foothold there where they just have a few ports on the shore of the Crusades. Here's a close-up. I kind of enlarged this and printed it out because you can see the yellow. I made it gold on purpose. The ports of the Venetians took. And so the real winners are the Venetians here. I mean, they had the maritime empire that persisted just for a long time, and they became very, very wealthy from all of this. And here is a castle on the Bosporus that these Crusaders built. Actually, these fiefs, really, in theory, they were feudal fiefs ruled by the emperor, the Latin Emperor Baldwin, but in reality, they were all independent. And what happened to them was the exact same thing that happened to the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and all of its subject counties. There was a lot of intermarriage, there was a lot of infighting and rivalry, where they all thought of themselves as equals, and we had democracy run rampant, and they sort of, fought until they disintegrated. And around 1261, the Byzantines started reconquering. So they really lasted from about 1204 to 1261, only about 50, 60 years. In October 1205, a third treaty laid down the amount of military services the Venetians owed the empire, and a kind of council was set up, composed of Frenchmen and Venetians. 3 treaties thus composed the constitution of the Latin state, that of March 1204, October 1204, and October 1205. And before he was crowned, each new emperor had to swear to observe them. A law code was also written up for the new empire and the new Latin states. It was the Assizes of Romania. And when you read these Assizes, they're feudal law personified. They're kind of like Magna Carta. What they do is institutionalize feudal law and the power of the individual barons against the emperor. The emperor is weak. The law of Jerusalem was adopted by the Latin Empire, but this was only perhaps a later legend. The Assizes of Romania were written, and they were feudal law. More probably, unwritten customary law prevailed throughout the empire. In fact, the interests of the emperor, the feudal nobility, and Venice were so much at variance that the Constitution only served to hasten the steady decline of the state. And when we say decline, I mean it declined from the moment it was formed. There was never a time when it was rising. It just declined from the moment it was formed. The Fourth Crusade was at an end, and no one spoke of sending help to the Holy Land. What they concentrated on was looting the Greek lands, the Greek Empire, of all its treasure. And in fact, refugees from Constantinople poured into Europe, bringing with them art and learning and treasures of all kinds. Plus, the Crusaders looted the city of its wealth and its relics, and all of that poured into Europe. The Latin kingdom, as I said, followed the pattern of the kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a feudal state with much infighting and rivalry, and eventually it disintegrated in local political rivalries and became so weak that the Emperor of Byzantium, who was left, was able to reconquer the kingdom starting in 1261. It took him a few years, but he ended up reconquering it all. Well, how was the Fourth Crusade different from the Crusades that preceded it? Here's where the discussion comes in. I left 12 minutes for discussion. How do you see this crusade as being different? There are obvious things that are different, but what are more subtle things? Yeah, Matthew.
It seems to have religious pretenses, but in reality, it's more of a political venture. and I think that's going to be a recurring theme throughout the rest of the Crusades that we're going to discuss.
Yeah, politics has risen to the forefront here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's exactly what you're describing. It's more of a political venture than it is a religious venture.
They've lost a little bit of their idealism and their simplicity. Things have gotten complicated. Yeah, did you have a comment?
I noticed that the motivation wasn't as clear-cut in the Fourth Crusade as it was in the preceding Crusades. Everybody had drastically different views, and even though in all the Crusades they seemed to have a hard time getting everything together totally, there was still kind of a unity as to what they wanted to do and how they did it. The Fourth Crusade, nobody got together. Nobody seemed to really be on the same wavelength as far as what they should do. There was too many backstabbing and too much lying and too much misinterpreting and mishandling of information. At least that's how I saw it.
Yeah, okay. And any other, yeah.
I was going to say I think the motivation changed because in the First Crusade there was really going to a mystery place where not very many people have been, and yet there's these evil people killing Christians, and so to them they were motivated to go after and do something that was a religious feeling as well. It wasn't political, it was also a religious zeal to it. Whereas in the Fourth Crusade it's been so institutionalized that it seemed like, okay, we're going here and politics get in the way and corruption gets in the way, and there wasn't the same motivation as there was before, so there wasn't the morale wasn't as high as in the First Crusade where, spiritualism was attached in it, whereas this one was more politics.
Yeah, Stephen, comment.
Well, just what I was thinking with all the ideas of politics and a lack of a real ideology behind the Fourth Crusade, it seems like they were almost just missing the middle management. In all the other Crusades, there were all the great heroes that were kind of sent forth to not only represent Europe and try to bring some kind of ideology to the Middle East, or to the Holy Lands, or wherever they were going, but they also kind of acted as a controlling force for the Crusades. They acted just in a way of not only sending stories back to the homelands in order to create some kind of mythical ideology for the people that were sending the Crusaders off, but also as just a unifying factor.
Yeah, and it all seemed to break down with this crusade, but we had little hints of this before. Remember that Richard Lionheart stopped in Cyprus and threw the Byzantines out and took the kingdom of Cyprus on his way to the Holy Land. So we had a hint that this might happen, and now it's full-blown. Yeah. Sorry.
I think
getting people's names.
I think that when you say that the motivations were different, they weren't as spiritually motivated, I think that for the people it was, because you spoke of a rebellion that was squashed, and that rebellion was because they weren't going to the Holy Land because they wanted to set out immediately. So I think the fault lies more with the Pope and who he appointed as the leaders, because it was the leaders who went. I mean, right from the beginning, they were going to go to Egypt and not just don't tell the Crusaders.
Yes, it was corrupt from the very beginning, and so they were sort of, the leaders were plotting with the Venetians to not go directly to the Holy Land, but to attack Egypt. So there's their idea of corruption there from the very beginning. But the Pope didn't appoint the leaders; they volunteered. Okay, all he did was not ask the kings to lead, and so the leaders were were volunteers. However, there was some election because Boniface of Montferrat was elected as leader. Yeah, Travis, did you have another point?
Yeah, but it was Innocent who decided to exclude the kings.
Yes.
And if he had invited them, then they would have been the leader by right, and I think that's where his fault is.
And if the kings had led, maybe the leaders wouldn't have had to make a deal with the Venetians either, and it would have been entirely different. Yeah, did you have a comment?
I was going to say, couldn't you also say there was excess baggage from the history of the relations with the Byzantine Empire, in the sense of they questioned the truth of everything that the emperors would say, because every time they went there, they were always, in a sense, lied to, or it was going in another different circle than what it really was. And so to them there was just resentment growing up from the past, and this just kind of came out in full force.
There was a lot of friction between the Byzantines and the Latins, and both of them hated each other, and both of them, were issuing publicity against each other, and there was a lot of hard feelings between them. So, there was history there that accounted for things. What about Robert of Clary's eyewitness account? Actually, I've listed the main characters here, which I took out of Villehardouin's account. So do these match Robert of Clary's main characters? Who is the hero, do you think, in Robert of Clary's account?
His brother.
His brother, okay. And this is a kind of common thing, to make your own relatives the heroes. Okay, any others?
However, he did not make himself the hero.
Mm-hmm.
That's he made his relatives, but not himself the hero. I found that rather intriguing. But I'm probably get to that in a little bit.
And you kind of liked him, huh? He seems like an honest person, a simple knight who has an honest viewpoint, as opposed to all these schemers at the top. Okay. Any other comments? Okay. Okay, Count Baldwin of Flanders and Henal, Henri of Flanders, his brother, Eustace of Flanders, his brother, Geoffrey of Villehardouin, who was Marshal of Champagne and Romania, Count Louis of Blois and Chartres, Count Hugh of St. Paul, the Marquis Boniface of Montferrat, and the Doge Enrico Dandolo of Venice. Did Robert consider the Venetians good guys or bad guys? Did you like them or not? What do you think? Well, press your mic.
I think they had to have them. They needed them for what they could provide.
They kind of needed them. But what did Robert think of the Venetians? What did you think Robert thought of the Venetians? Yeah, Matthew.
He had a love-hate relationship with them.
Kind of love-hate, yeah.
I mean, when they were helpful, he was nothing but praise for the Venetians. However, whenever the Venetians would put up a stink, for example, when they're talking about the payment of the 33,000 marks, he was not quite as praising of them.
Yeah, so he saw the necessity for having them, and so he really saw that they were needed and they were necessary. But he also saw their bad points. I mean, their negative side, which they showed pretty often. I mean, the Venetians come across in the whole story as pretty greedy, I think, when you look at them. How about the Byzantines? And actually, Geoffrey of Villehardouin saw the Venetians as really bad. Okay, he saw them as the evil guys in the whole story. How about the Byzantines? How did Robert of Clary see the Byzantines? Okay. Travels.
I didn't get a strong impression either way.
Okay.
Just neutral, I guess.
He was much more even-handed. Okay, yeah.
He recognized them as the enemy, but not to the same extent as Saladin or Zengi or any of the Seljuk Turks were considered the enemy in the past.
Yeah.
Actually, the people I think he did consider the enemy were the Byzantine emperors. For example, when Alexius was raised back to the crown in Isaac II, and they went back on their deal. He saw them as rather villainous, but the Byzantine as a people, I don't think he saw as an enemy.
Okay.
Maybe an opposing force, but not a demonized enemy like the opponents have been in the past.
Yeah. They all, well, one of the mistakes that Alexius III made was that he promised them too much. He promised them much more than he could deliver, and he probably knew he couldn't deliver it. And so he was dishonest there from the beginning. And so I think that Robert saw that. But Robert is sort of a simple guy. I mean, he sees things in a very innocent way, don't you think?
Yeah, the people that he's most critical of are the leaders that stole all his plunder.
Yes.
So only when it affected him did he get really fired up about it.
Yeah. But he's a pretty even-handed kind of witness, but also he's kind of like innocent in that he's not among the plotters. Which actually Geoffrey de Villehardouin was among the plotters, which meant he was much more, took sides much more than the others. Okay. And what is the general impression you get of the Venetians? What is your opinion of the Venetians?
I was just going to say they're kind of looking for a profit, and I mean, you know, one side in a sense looks at them negatively, but I would do the same thing if they were my bill collector. So, you know, it's just you view negatively on your bill collector, yet you're the ones who signed the contract, so you've got to deal with it and face up to it. That's how I see it. And the Venetians are doing the same thing, just saying, look, you signed this contract, you live up to it whether you like it or not. That's how we are merchants. And it was a different culture based, I guess, on theirs. And the Venetian, it was kind of a clash of culture.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's a clash of culture, and they don't really understand each other. And the Venetians did predictable things according to their merchant culture and their merchant class. What is the general impression you get of the Franks? What do you think of them? Anybody? Are they as double-dealing as the Venetians, or caught in a trap, or what? Matthew?
I think the Frankish populace, Robert O'Clery and company, they seem to be fairly straightforward people. They knew what they needed to do and they did it. However, it was the nobility, Boniface, the count of this, the count of that, count of the other place. They were the ones that seemed to be more two-timing. Once the Latin emperor had been named and crowned and everything, and he went to go, I can't remember the name of the place that he was asked to go conquer. Mm. But it was after that the Marquis decided to go and attack Adrianople. And once he realized that the emperor was coming back, and he said, please have mercy on me, have mercy on me. And then everything was okay again.
Oh, okay. So, well, the Venetian, but both of them were doing, what was sort of natural to them in a way. I mean, I think you have to think of the Venetians as doing what merchants would do. And naturally they took the lion's share because they had paid most of the money into it. I'm sure they felt that they were absolutely right in what they were doing in building their power. Well, okay, it's time for our break, and when we come back, we'll look at a couple of issues briefly before we get on to the military orders and the Northern Crusade. Okay?